we're really aiming this at project investigators, researchers, people like yourselves who may actually have been working with particular projects that may be funded by Research Council, maybe academic funded projects in your own institutions. And we've worked with lots of people in that position over the last 5.5 years. And many of these questions that come up about how project websites should be constructed, what kinds of issues to think about in design, what kinds of things are going to make them last, we find time and time again from the experience we've had. And so we're particularly addressing this to anybody who's authoring or building some kind of online resources. We've got a particular focus on materials about social science research methods, but actually most of what's said here is relevant even more broadly than that. What we're going to do is to look over at some of these questions. These are the kinds of things that people have been asking us in terms of what sort of design principles it's useful to follow, whether or not you might use tools already in your university and your institution, such as a virtual learning environment, or perhaps you should build a separate website, what kinds of information you might need to collect from the contributors to your project, how you might monitor and increase the usage so that you find out whether anybody's actually there and listening to and looking at what you've done, and what you should be able to do towards the ending of the project to make sure that the materials carry on being useful into the future. I would just highlight that the ReStore project's produced a series of guidance which is directed at exactly the same kind of subject area that we're covering this afternoon. And it's there on restore.ac.uk/guidance. There's various different ways of interacting with it. And so some of the specifics of, perhaps we might mention a tool or a URL. If there's something that you want to follow up and you don't, perhaps we won't read out the URLs this afternoon, we would encourage you to take a look at that guidance site, because everything that we might mention that requires going and looking up a very specific item, you'll find it in that site. So ReStore project's been running for around 5.5 years. It's an activity associated with the National Centre for Research Methods here in Southampton. And what we've particularly been doing is working with projects funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, a variety of different initiatives, particularly the National Centre for Research Methods, but also the Researcher Development Initiative and originally the Research Methods Programme. These are all investments where the Research Council has funded different academics, different institutions to create online materials. And what typically happens is that people complete their website as they get to the end of their project funding. Often there's really good academic content, lots of practical value inside these materials, but immediately the project ends, maybe members of the team move on to different posts, and then the thing isn't maintained and it immediately becomes perhaps invisible to the world, bits get broken, and there's a huge loss of value. And so what we've been doing is endeavouring to work with people to help them avoid that by designing in ways of making their sites last as long as possible, but also ReStore operates a repository where we are hosting sites from many completed projects. I'm not going to major on the details of ReStore this afternoon, because you may well be listening in and there's no particular reason why you would expect your online material, your website, to need to come to ReStore. But the reason for explaining what we've been doing is just so that you understand that we're working very much with projects in a similar situation to that which I sense many of you are. And what we've been trying to do is to look at completed project sites, do maintenance on them to try and make sure that the quality and the utility is maximised, do what work we can to make sure that they are as accessible as possible, make sure that there's one place people know where to go and find them, and we're doing this as part of our work at National Centre for Research Methods, but we're not in any sense suggesting that the ReStore repository is the only solution for your project, as it might be. It might be very better options in specific instances, but actually many of the principles are going to be very similar, and that's what we're focusing on this afternoon. The way that we've worked with ReStore, which helps you to understand questions you might want to think about in relation to your own material, is that after some initial contact between the site authors and the ReStore project, we've organised a peer review of the existing materials and identified the kinds of work that would be required to bring them into the ReStore repository. And I'll show you an example or two in a moment which will make this very, very concrete. We have then carried on maintaining those project sites in the ReStore repository. And what that means is that we've now worked with a large number of people who, just like yourselves, have created research project websites, and we've then needed to actually go and undertake a review of what's there, both the academic content and the technical nature of the site, and help those authors move their material, if you like, into a long-term maintained phase where they, the authors, are not actively involved in them on a day-to-day basis. So it's very much our hope that that experience we want to share with you will be useful to you. And that's where we're heading in the next few slides. It's worth understanding which things we've been reviewing when we go through this. We undertake a technical review. Members of the ReStore team have been doing that, which actually looks at the architecture of the sites that have been created, the kind of portability that's within them, whether or not they've used software tools that would be difficult to transfer to a different server. We've looked at potential intellectual property rights issues as to whether or not there's content that's not licensed that's been included in those resources. And that bundle of technical issues are very relevant to you if you're setting out thinking about designing or you are currently building a project site. Clearly, in an academic setting, we're also interested in an academic review. We've gone out to external peer reviewers just as we would with an academic journal article, and sought their views on the academic content, the rigour, the referencing, whether or not material needs to be updated. And if there's the opportunity to intervene and enhance content in that way, it's something we've been able to assist authors with. And then we also ask the author themselves to reflect on their experience and what they've created, because often the author knows best about, shall we say, the wobbly parts inside a website. They know the things that never quite got completed. And by bringing those three aspects together, we've been able to undertake a good level of maintenance across quite a large number of materials now, and then to take them into the repository and keep on publishing them to the world. And it might be useful to bear in mind that if you're a current site author thinking about the technical, the academic, and if you like that authoring experience, is a very good way to organise your thinking around the online material which you're creating. So what we're hoping to do, and this summarises it before we move on, is we are building a repository for completed online resources. And we have focused very much on trying to restore, enhance quality and utility in those kinds of tools. And that's allowed us to develop guidance for existing projects, but also to be able to develop quite a lot of practical assistance and advice that we've given to specific authors. And there's a circularity there. The more we've spoken with resource authors, the more it's helped us with the maintenance work. The more we've worked with the maintenance, the more we've seen common pitfalls, lessons that could be learned for the future. And so it's very much in the hope that we can share that experience with you that we'll move into the next section of the webinar. Just have a couple of slides here to indicate to you the sorts of things that may have been we've been doing. These are illustrations from web resources created by other people that are currently coming through into ReStore. So the types of things which we've been doing include, for example, you see in this slide we have a little red ring around this site with news. Very often when you may have an active project site, you'll be publishing news of forthcoming events, of research seminars. You might be wanting to draw attention to a new publication. You might be wanting to tell the world about staffing changes which are very current to the project. And so there is a set of what I tend to call ephemera, which are meaningful during the life of your project, but which really don't carry across well into the long-term existence of that website if you want it to last beyond the project's duration. And so we are really encouraging people to think about separating out that kind of ephemeral content in such a way that it would be very easy to take it out of your site, and that the remaining content, if you like, the academic, the intellectual, the tutorial type materials that might be in there, are going to still make sense very much without the ephemeral content, which is going to look very dated after a few months beyond project end. Here's another site which we're working on at the moment, the Understanding Population Trends and Processes site. And just highlighted in there, you can see the difference where this site existed on the web, as most of the resources we've dealt with already had, but we've brought them into ReStore. In our world, that means we've effectively added that blue banner that you see across the top, which allows the user to navigate around the ReStore repository as well as the original content. But you'll see a few areas which have been ringed in this case. The sorts of things we've been doing as we've taken projects on into the future is to make sure that somebody who might want to contact the authors effectively generates email to the ReStore repository, and we're able to direct that appropriately to whoever the authors have nominated after the project's ended. And again, there's a general principle there of thinking about who's going to be the one that's responsible for answering user inquiries from your content after the project has ended. And that's actually a frequent challenge for the people that we've been working with. It's surprising how rapidly the principal investigators and co-investigators move institution, and you can end up with orphan websites with really useful intellectual content, and a researcher who might want to take advantage of your work comes along, reads your website, they want to send a follow-up email, and it disappears into the ether. So thinking about where would contacts about your material be redirected, very important principle, something which we've been doing directly through ReStore. You'll see also an update there on the left which just highlights that a statement that the project has ended and that it's been put into the ReStore repository. Again, this sense of removing the ephemeral information such that people can carry on reading the site and understanding its content. And down at the bottom we've just put a ring around the privacy statement. It takes a different form for different projects, but we've been very meticulous about helping all of the authors we've worked with to make sure that they've got the proper rights to use the content that appears in their site, whether that might be PowerPoints from event speakers, text from co-contributors, images which have been used in the creation of the website, and allows us to think through and record that all those things have been done properly. One final example, and there may be one further slide actually here. This is a site, International Social Research Methods, where we worked with the authors in the creation of their material, because they didn't have it all available online at the end of the project. And so we created a simple frame for them in order to place it there using the style of the SRC's Research and Development Initiative. And actually this site, although visually quite simple, contains quite complex search tools and a database which knows about a variety of case studies, and the user can come in and search in different ways for them. And that's something which we were actually able to help that team to construct, because it wasn't expertise which they had in-house. So in summary, when we look back at the work we've been doing with project investigators, we see this set of commonly challenging areas, and that's what we're going to focus on for the remainder of this webinar. We're going to have an opportunity, in case you have any questions in the immediate term, in just a couple of moments' time. But we will then move on to talk about these two blocks. Effectively, you could think of this as representing design issues and implementation issues. The design issues, which we would always encourage people to think very carefully about, are those to do with the content and coverage of their website, metadata and access in terms of how it's described and how other people will find it when they search for it on the web, technology and software considerations, and that really relates quite strongly to what skills you may have in your team for creating a website or creating a web resource of different types. And we'll return specifically to the issue of when it might or might not be a good idea to use an institutional virtual learning environment or content management system. And then in the final block, we will actually look at some of the practical implementation issues, the importance of making sure that a resource ends up complete and up to date, and some hints around how you can monitor usage and how that may actually help you to adjust your content if you understand who's using it. Some thoughts around who is the team which owns your material. That could be quite complex if there's multiple institutions involved. That leads on to a brief consideration of intellectual property rights and ownership considerations, and just good advice in terms of having some kind of takedown policy which allows someone who isn't happy with what you've done or who's got questions about its whether or not that you might have infringed their IPR, to very clearly contact a responsible person and to raise those issues, and that you would know how you'd get your material down off the web should you need to. Okay, so no specific questions that related directly to ReStore there. I think quite a lot of you are quite familiar with the ReStore project. So what we're going to do is to move into this next block and think about some of those design issues. And particularly, I noticed that one or two of the questions that were sent in advance do relate to design as well. So using those headings that we've already introduced, I'm going to look at content and coverage, metadata and access, technology considerations, and the pros and cons of using pre-existing content management systems. Clearly, each of the web resources that you might be involved in creating is going to be quite unique, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to say here is a blueprint that makes the right project website design. There are some examples in ReStore where we have quite a wide variety of project designs which we've taken on, and so I just highlight a couple there. In, for example, the geo-refer learning materials, which you could find if you were to come back at a different time and have a look in the ReStore website, there was an explicit learning design. This was a web resource which was intended to teach users about geographical referencing of social science data sets. And it was constructed from a large number of small learning objects, blocks of information material, which can be browsed as separate web pages, but which were intended to be put together as customized tutorials for the user. So there is an example of an explicit learning design. Those objects were divided into conceptual material, examples, blocks which explained techniques, and the idea was to keep them very separate so that it was possible to update individual sections, for example, to update the techniques to reflect a new software version, and that would be possible without breaking the overall design where concepts may not have changed. Another very common structure which we have encountered for research methods websites is where people have a project which has been structured around a series of events, such as a seminar series or a specialist masterclass. Typically, this would be an event organised by the project investigators, but often involving external speakers. And people may have recorded those presentations as podcasts or as video, or they may have notes and PowerPoints and possibly practical exercises from an event which has been held. With that kind of material, if there's a really strong narrative around it which would allow someone to come back and use it again in the future, then it may well be that it makes sense to place the whole collection together in a repository like ReStore. But it may also be that if actually what you have are a series of quite disconnected events where there is effectively a document which an external presenter has produced, maybe a paper, it might be a guidance document on using a particular statistical method, then it would be worth considering whether that sort of material would be better off placed in a document repository. For example, many institutions now have some kind of e-prints or DSpace, which is actually an institutional repository. Strangely, there's been a lot more interest in this in the preparation for the REF in the UK at the moment, where it's possible to simply go and access those documents from an institutional website. And if they are really best viewed as individual documents, that may be the right solution. So we would suggest that if you've got things which are effectively academic outputs without a strong connection between them, you'll probably find that people can access them strongly in a document repository. Whereas if the whole collection has merit and there is some way in which there's a narrative to be played around the collection, which perhaps might allow someone to start at an introductory level, work through a series of examples or presentations, and actually have a sequence of learning or a sequenced experience that they can use as reference material, then probably is better to keep it together. And I just re-emphasise our experience that in designing that kind of site, it's always worth keeping the ephemeral content easily separable, such that news, forthcoming events, information about staffing changes and contact details are very clearly kept in a separate space or on separate pages which can be easily separated. I'm just going to repeat that. I think maybe there was a little glitch in the audio. It's just making the point that the emphasis there should be making sure that that kind of ephemeral content is very easily separated. So this is the GeoRefer material which I referenced just now. You'll see it's here presented inside ReStore, and this particular site had a large number of tutorial objects. We're looking at the top of one at the moment. This one was about getting grid coordinates from postcodes in Microsoft Access and linking postcoded records. So it's very specific learning content. And the way that this one's been constructed has meant that it's been very easy in ReStore to maintain the entire set without it being entangled with specific bits of detail which related just to the time that the project existed. Over on the left-hand side, there are still some links in there, such as an email us link and information about staff. But what we've simply done in taking that beyond the end of the project is to place the email redirection straight to the ReStore repository, and the staff materials, making sure that they're presented in the past tense, saying this material was authored by this team, but not suggesting to the user that the team is still there to be contacted in the same way, because some of them will have moved. One of the most important issues that leads on to in thinking about what the content may be, whether it's a single integrated website, a collection of learning resources, perhaps a site that explains a series of events, relates to the metadata about those web pages. Now, the metadata in this sense actually relates to key information which is embedded in the web pages that has a very big impact on what search engines like Google or Yahoo are going to find. And often people are somewhat dismayed that their great pages they created are not appearing very highly rated by the search engines. They don't appear very high when somebody searches. And it's important to understand that actually the metadata in those pages is what's used by the search engines to build the index, and therefore explicitly putting in metadata terms which are going to be ones people would find useful in looking for your content and making them specific to each page is a really important aspect of helping websites to be found. The best metadata is that which can be created by the original authors at the time that they're creating the pages. And I think it would be fair to say that one of the things we found most frequently overlooked is that most academic authors who've got the imperative to put something on the web usually haven't managed to go the extra mile and create rich metadata. But the disappointing thing is then that their great content is not necessarily easily findable, whereas those pages which have got good metadata in them are going to be much more readily found. So our message very, very strongly to resource authors is not only to worry about the content, but to think about smart ways in which the right metadata is there. And that might well include thinking about the terms that people would use to search if you were hoping they would arrive at your web content. So the acronym of a project name is not going to be a great piece of metadata. It might be useful to have it there, but unless somebody already knows it, they're not likely to search for it. But if you have a web resource that's about a particular type of research methods, maybe it's qualitative interviews, then you're going to want to make sure that qualitative interviews occurs in the metadata keywords in those pages, so that that's actually going to be found as a result of people searching in that way. And we'll see a little more of this in a moment. Another question which we've been asked many times is whether or not there's any good reason for restricting access either to an entire project website or to part of a project website. Now, this may often be the case in development where a team of authors, perhaps in different places, are working together, and they don't really want everybody in the outside world to see the pages they're working on. Or maybe they're engaged in some kind of collaborative research and they want some password protected means of accessing the pages. Our suggestion there is very much that although there is no harm in using some social media or sharing site to have a discussion, you could use Dropbox, you could use Google Hangouts, use shared Google documents, use an institutional hard drive if you have means of sharing it to actually have your internal discussion. It is not an ideal model to be placing material that you're eventually going to want and hope that people will find behind user registration. And there's two major reasons for that. One is it is a major disincentive for external users if they have to register to use your site. We know that lots of people come to interesting pages, see that they've got to register and don't go any further. But also there is a substantial overhead in properly maintaining user registrations and logins. And actually your institution would be rightly concerned about the data protection issues that would be involved in that. Because if you're registering users and maintaining information about their contact details, you have obligations about how you look after their personal data, and those include obligations to keep it up to date, and that gets very, very difficult to do after a project has ended, because you may not have anybody who's got the time and the availability to do that task. So generally speaking, our advice has been to make material open wherever possible, and to think in terms of open standards and open access, which is very much the publication model that the research councils and others are looking for at present. Just to go back to the metadata and make it a little clearer, there are a variety of standards around for ways of describing web content. One of the very commonly used ones is Dublin Core metadata. It's not massively complex. Effectively, it defines a variety of fields, titles, creators, keywords, publishers, the name, the subject, some dates, which would normally be required, and a relatively small number of these fields are required to create a complete set of Dublin Core metadata. And there are tools around. The example which we have here is one from UKOLN, which allows you to use their tool to annotate an existing web page. So if, for example, we had all gathered together this afternoon and we created a ReStore webinar web page, we could go to this tool, enter the URL of that web page, and it will begin to populate for us a set of metadata. And if it can find what the title of the page is, or it can find any of the other keywords, it will populate this form. But it will allow us to add in other details, so we might decide to add in the identity of the author, or a publisher, or some dates. And when we've completed this form and press a submit button, the tool simply generates a block of text which we can then use and paste back into the original page. So it saves us as the user all of the technical effort in knowing how to do the task. It allows us to simply fill in a form about our page with the right kinds of key terms and the right keywords, and it generates the block of text which can be pasted back into the web pages. And that text will then be exposed to all of the search engines which will be looking to index your pages. So there are some very useful tools around which mean that there's a very low overhead in generating good metadata for pages that you might be wanting to create. Clearly that leads on to some other technology and software considerations. And these relate to the software that you might be wanting to use in creating the site, but also software which you might assume the user has available in order to use the site. So I'm conscious that in any of the audiences we've spoken to, which almost certainly in the ReStore audience this afternoon, we've got quite a diversity of technical experience, probably from some individuals who are very technically adept and have got a variety of websites which they've authored and maintained, and perhaps some authors of content, maybe principal investigators on academic projects, who hope that someone else in the team will be able to deal with all the technical stuff. Clearly, the first consideration is that if you're going to create your own web pages, it's not really the most effective means to do this without some kind of web authoring tool. There are a variety of very good tools around. It's not particularly in our role to go recommending using Dreamweaver or Microsoft Visual Studio one over the other. You need to understand what teams and what support might be available to you. but these are effectively editing tools which allow you to relatively painlessly build new web pages. And you want to be very clear what tool you're going to use before you design, and if you like, lay out the pages that might be the subject and the content of your material, such that you're very clear about what sorts of media you might be able to include, and whether or not the way that you're going to do it is going to have particular constraints. You're also obviously going to need the assistance of somebody probably within your university institution who's going to tell you where on the web can they host your material. Is it going to go on a website maintained by a faculty, a website maintained by a central computing service, because they may have very specific requirements in terms of online security. They may not be happy for you to host certain open source tools on their servers, and you probably need to have that conversation with them early on so that it's a very clear technical path. You know which tools you're going to use, you know who you're going to talk to in order to get that material actually put up on the web, and it's possible to build a production line with a reasonably effective route of communication. The other things which we just particularly would highlight here with regards to software are issues around software which different resources assume is available to the user. Now, in one level, we would clearly recommend that you try to make your websites as open as possible, and therefore not to rely on the user needing special plugins or special browser features because of the tendency of these to change very rapidly. And therefore, if a website can only be viewed, or the video or the material that you want to play is dependent on a particular version of somebody else's software, you run a very significant risk that within a year or two nobody will be able to read what you've created because they can't get hold of that version of that tool anymore, or it might be blocked by their browser, or for many university users they may find that their computing service doesn't allow them to install it on their PC. So you need to think in terms of the most openly accessible tools for presentation on the web, but also quite a few of the materials which we've now hosted in ReStore are actually designed to help users to use a piece of software. So this is a very different sense in which the user may be being guided in using SPSS, for example, or ArcGIS, which is a geographic information system software. And the consideration of importance there is to ensure that if your online content includes examples how to use external software, then you must have a licensed version of that software yourself, and you do need to seek whether or not there are any permissions or requirements of the software provider before you go putting screenshots or guidance of their material on the web. And both SPSS and ArcGIS, software tools which are widely used in UK universities, the suppliers of those software do have particular requirements, and particularly they're keen that anybody who's got software for educational use is not going out into the commercial marketplace, as it were, and delivering training on using that software. So we can't commend strongly enough the merit in working out what permissions might be required before you place software examples online within your resources. Now, I mentioned, one or two of you are probably already very familiar with this, that you're going to need, if you're working in a university, probably anywhere in the world, some interaction with your university's IT service if you want to create a project website or you want to put up new material on a university website. And often at this point people ask, well, wouldn't it just be simpler to use the content management system which my university uses for example, a departmental website, or indeed, couldn't I just put up my project content in a virtual learning environment? For example, Blackboard, which is very widely used, Moodle, which is an open source software tool which lots of universities are using. And if you have the joy of being a contributor to a departmental website, you probably used one of these content management systems whereby you put content, maybe text, maybe images, into a very simple set of web forms, and all of the formatting and presentation is handled by the software in order to deliver a really slick looking website. And lots of information is drawn from a database such that member of staff's contact details, news feeds from elsewhere in the institution are all very readily handled. That is one way of constructing a project website. We'll turn to that example in a moment. The virtual learning environments, any of you who are actually at university teachers will be very familiar with this as a means of conveying course materials. Lots of them have got wikis and blogs and discussion forums and other tools of that kind embedded within them. Again, they may have some merit as a means of hosting a project website. There are, of course, externally hosted environments, discussion groups, wikis, which some academic projects have chosen to use, where you are going right outside the university environment and placing all your content on a third-party website, which is run by some other large organisation. And it's possible to find proprietary and open source varieties of almost all of these. Now clearly, like everything else here, the answer depends on your specific circumstances. There are some quite useful general principles. Here we have the screen that I see when I, as a tutor in Southampton, want to come and log into the university's Blackboard site. And when I go into a particular course, it's clearly taken from one of my courses on census and neighbourhood analysis, there is very much a presentation mode within Blackboard which allows me to put up folders of material, to control the way in which students in my courses see content. It's a very useful and helpful mechanism for putting up content which others are going to download and to organise that content. Also to host discussions and online forums. There are, however, some important considerations to bear in mind here. The first one is that these systems do require user registration. And even though most institutional implementations will allow guests to register, by choosing the virtual learning environment solution for a research project website or for a project website of any kind, you are going along the line of requiring user registration, which will deter many users. It's also the case that the guest accounts, which most universities make available, provide very limited functionalities to the guests, and that may extend to preventing them from taking part in any discussion or from using any of the interactive tools other than downloading content. So you may run the risk that your external users, people who would be research users who are interested in your content, are effectively highly restricted in what they can do. And you are clearly running this on the basis that you're trusting that the institutional environment will remain the same and that the course content will be updated or rolled over or continue to be available, and that it won't be disappearing at the end of the academic year or archived as would happen with a traditional talk program. And all of that might require some detailed discussion with the person in your institution who manages these environments. They can have great advantages if what you want to do is to actively tutor a course where you would like external parties to come in, to read online content, to engage in a discussion, to get tutor feedback, but that does assume that your project is going to have the staff resource there to provide that feedback, to be monitoring the discussions, and to actually make sure that's going to be happening in the long term. And if that's not realistically the position that your project is in, our recommendation would be probably not to use this kind of tool as a project site. But if you do want to do it, we'd suggest thinking about whether there's merit in using an open source tool such as Moodle, which allows a greater degree of customization and project independence from the institutional virtual learning environment. So there are a variety of issues around the VLE use, and we'll come back if people have questions there. This is the home page for geography at Southampton. It's a traditional external-facing web page, and the point here is it has been produced with a content management system. So almost everything in the format and the design of this page has been devised by the central comms and web team in the university. So all of the detail, the latest news pages on the right, who we are, the research, the structure, the image across the top is being drawn from a central repository. And only the panes of information, that we see in the centre, a lively community in the pursuit of excellence, providing a supportive environment for success. Just that text and those images are being entered by the departmental users, who are literally looking at a project page of this kind. They're filling in details in a web form, saying, I'd like this image to appear, I'd like this piece of text, with very little control over how it appears, except that it will go into a standard page template. Again, there are benefits potentially for research projects, maybe your project, if you're not already creating a site, to think, should we use the content management system of our institution? It has the advantage that your material can appear very clearly institutionally branded. You may be able to get just a different colour scheme or just some different images that have a strong family feel and lots of pre-built links with the institutional site. The disadvantage with this one is that it can be very difficult to extract your content if the content management system changes or if you should want to move it. And we've certainly excuse me, we've certainly had some real challenges with ReStore content which teams of people have built in their institutional environments. And effectively, if you haven't maintained a clean copy of all the text and all the content externally, there's very little alternative but to go downloading all the files individually and rebuilding the site completely afresh if you would want to move it, should you change institution, or if you needed to change the structure for some other reason. So, we can summarise a few strengths and weaknesses of going via those institutional systems. So, one of the strengths is clearly it's very easy to set up a new site. The advantage is that there's very little technical knowledge required. You, the user, can just focus on your content. Somebody else does all the technical maintenance. There's a lack of control which you might conceive of as being very good. However, the weaknesses in this area are you get very limited design options. It's actually quite difficult for the individual page content to be visible to search engines. So if you put your presentations inside a Blackboard site, or possibly inside a content management system, you may find that Google doesn't find them. They're not web archived by crawlers and search engines that would come looking for them. You may find problems of access control because your users have got to register, and at worst they may have to re-register each year. It can be very difficult to export, move or reformat your content, and in a sense it's the flip side, that you have a lack of control in the areas where you'd like control. You might conceive that as a bad lack of control. Here was an example from I think, University of Warwick, a site that was built within an institutional content management system. It's a really nice looking site, but it was very, very difficult to move. It was difficult to move for the reasons that we've just explained, where they were using a proprietary system within the institution, and effectively to take it out, to move it, required the entire site to be dismantled and rebuilt again. An example of the content inside that site, again, really nice presentation tools and navigation tools. Very complex to design some of those in a standalone site, but with the big downside of actually being able to move it. The Understanding Population Trends and Processes site, which you see now, which we mentioned earlier, is an example of a site which is built on an open source content management system. And this one is a WordPress based site. Somebody asked us a question along the way here about using tools like Moodle and Drupal and WordPress. The advantage of the open source site is that it was very easy for the ReStore project to effectively create a new instance of that site. And what you see here is content which in different panes on the screen is being drawn from the database within the WordPress site, and other text which has been saved, and it's a much more flexible way of working. Now, even if you are working on something you might never conceive that the ReStore project would be involved in it, there are real issues to consider whether or not you might ever want to roll over your content into some site in the future. And our experience is it's much easier to do that with the open source tools, just because of the control that you're going to have that you wouldn't have inside an institutional tool. Taking stuff out can be very time consuming. It can be very hard to reproduce your look and feel and get the functionality back. And it can actually be very difficult inside a content management system to identify what all the files do and to extract the templates. And you're probably going to need a programmer to sit and work with you to disentangle it. But if you do want to use a site, our experience would be definitely consider using Moodle or Drupal, where effectively the content and the system become open and you have much more flexibility in moving them around and in making changes to them in the future.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. So just to talk you through the rest of the sections in the webinar, I will ideally start from a couple of issues which we normally encounter when we take a resource from the actual authors. So that is the first thing, is just to ensure when we have got the resource and the extent of completeness and the timeliness in terms of whether it needs further update before we go live with it on the ReStore website. And then once we have sorted out all those issues with the authors and with the contributors, and then once we have gone live with the web resource on the ReStore website, the next thing is to start monitoring the use. Because as Dave outlined in the last couple of slides, that it's quite important to us to ensure that what we are hosting is of value to the users, and using some free tools like Google Analytics and Bing sitemap tool, which some of you might have heard about, which are quite free tool and anybody can use it right from day one to monitor the usages. That actually kind of help us in the review stage when we are reviewing a web resource. So if we know that number of good users base are using a web resource initially, then it provides a good impetus to start archiving a web resource, and for us to determine after 6 months whether we still need to continue hosting a web resource. The team membership, so as they pointed out, this is a stage when we are sorting out some issues with the various contributors working in different institutions when they would have worked on a particular web resource. Looking at whether they were in different sort of contracts with the actual PI of the web resource, and the IPR and ownership consideration. Yes, there are a range of things which we sort out, and there are a couple of people involved, like our legal expert colleagues here in Southampton and the legal expert colleague of the hosting institutions wherever the PI has secured funding in the first place. And then the takedown policy is, it was picked up in the initial slides, to come up with to find out what sort of situation, in how many, or what would be the situations where we would have to take down the materials from the website. Like in a few instances, we did it in the past as well. So these are a couple of things which we basically have to sort out with the. So the slides is just like to retrospectively saying it again, is the importance of finishing the project with a complete resource and one that is up to date. So like references to relevant literatures and softwares. So the broken links are checked at the very first stage, and then later on after 6 months review to ensure that there aren't any broken links. And then obviously the exit strategy is, if we, for instance, find out that there isn't any good users base, then obviously after a few years, then we would have then to decide to stop hosting the web resource, and that will be in the very first stage when we find out that whether the material needs to be restored or not. This is just to show you that the broken link report that we generate at the very beginning of our review process So if there are a couple of broken links inside the web resource, then we bring it to the attention of the web resource authors so that they can either find out themselves how to fix them and whether they want to commission it out. So obviously, yes, for fixing out any technical issues in the web resource are paid by us. We have a certain amount of funds dedicated to this in order to bring the web resource into shape before putting it into ReStore web repository. ESRC emphasis on impact, which is, as I mentioned earlier on, monitoring does matter to us both at the beginning and after we have restored web resource. So we do recommend to the authors that they should consider this at the very outset of any project. So yes, it could be started with you could just keep a record of whosoever is attending the workshop, like workshop participants, or consider an online user survey asking people in what sort of capacity you could increase the usage of a particular website. Yes, you can use you can ask them about their feedback. So it could be just only a 3-4 field web page where you can ask a couple of simple questions which could just give you an idea in how many ways or where exactly on your web resource you could improve the content quality, the typography, the design, or those kind of issues which they have picked up on earlier on. So most useful information to, as I say, Google Analytics, which could be quite easily done. So obviously, if any of you have any problem, or any of you are at the stage of creating now a web resource at the very initial stages, we would be quite happy to help you out in how to set it up. So if you could just drop us an email, then we would be quite happy to copy you a link whereby you can just do it quite easily. So this is just like a screenshot from Google Analytics web tool, where you can see, for example, like we are seeing from September 2012 to July 2013, that how many number of people visited ReStore website, and how many returned, how many were new, and how many were returning to the website. So this is a case. This slide just shows the overall usage of the ReStore website. But here you can see that we do maintain every web resource monitoring on this page, whereby you can see different web resources like archiving qualitative data, georefer resource. It just tells you how many people are using which web resource in a particular period of time. And then obviously it just gives us an idea what are the sources, are the traffic sources of users which bring them to ReStore website. So for example, YouTube is now on top, and WordPress, similarly Facebook and Twitter. So similar, there are so many other features which I don't want to go into, basically, like what sort of device are you using. These kind of things can give you a fair idea, basically, about the traffic sources on your web resource. This slide just shows what people search in Google are in one of the top search engines like Microsoft search engine or Google, which basically pick your web resource against those keywords. So if somebody just says focus group ground rules, they brought the search results in which 22 out of the total results appeared in the result sets from the ReStore website, and 8 out of 22 were clicked. That means that were that much effective for users in terms of findability of the content. So for example, I just wanted to say that if you don't have a searching tool or a monitoring usage tool on your website, you won't be basically able the usage or the impact factor of your web resource, so that's quite important to consider. It's just like to tell you a bit of ReStore user survey, because I said it in the website, but we have done it as well, basically, on the ReStore website, and one of the surveys is still running on some section of the ReStore website, the output of which will be published quite soon now on our website. So for example, this is just like to show you that it just gives us an impression that what sort of users, what type of users are using the ReStore web resources, or your web resources, or when you have restored them into ReStore repository, where exactly the users are coming from, and what is the what is the feedback we are receiving in terms of whether it's useful or not. So yes, as I covered this already, is different people from different institutions can be working on one single project, which basically generates a few issues at the time of restoration or archiving of that web resource in our repository. So these are a couple of questions like, is ownership of the material clearly articulated? So that's, if you pay particular attention to this by maintaining just a list of people at the very outset of the project, at the very beginning of every stage in developing a web resource, it would be quite easier if you have a list of people and what sort of contribution they've been making into your web resource. Where did all the content come from? So yes, it could be just an Excel sheet where you can just list out number of people with the type of work they have done for you and the dates when they did it and where exactly the author was based in at the time of contribution. The PI host institution have documented permission. So that could be a permission. You can call it just permission list or IPR list, which you can then exchange with either ReStore team or wherever you want to restore or archive your web resources at the end of your project. So the ideal scenario would be to the researchers are still available, which is really of help to us because they understand what we exactly are asking, and they could just fix the issues which we point out in our review process. More commonly, but that's sadly not the case, because in most cases we struggle with accessing or getting hold of people who could be of help to us in different capacity, like technical, who can just fix the links for us, and legal expertise who can basically give us sign off a license for us so that we can freely make the resource available on the ReStore website. So these are a couple of issues basically that if, as I mentioned in the previous slide, if you have a list of everything like the proper documentation, that will be far easier to address at the time of restoring the web resource. So typical IPR scenarios is all authors in the same institutions or clear, which is the most ideal situation, which is quite clear, and everybody can just, we can quite easily restore the web resource. And different components in a web resource like images, papers, screenshots, audio, videos, those could be obtained by using one of our contributor permissions form, which is available on the ReStore guidance page, which you can freely download and use. Issue of multiple academic contributors is institutional affiliations during disaster development. That could be one of the trickiest issues, whereby we have to approach multiple institutions to sign off a license before restoring a web resource. Very common is presentation from speakers at event collect permissions. So before, while organizing a workshop or seminar, the most easiest thing that you could do is just to fill out the details, the basic detail of the speakers, where the speaker comes from and what is the presentation title and when was it delivered. Something like this could be of real value at the time of restoring a web resource. So these are, for example, is a screenshot where which been taken from Microsoft Access, whereby you must, for example, like while showing the slides on a web page of in your web resource, you must declare that this screenshot has come from Microsoft Access or any other software company like ArcGIS. So that is quite paramount to address the issue right from the outset. And these kind of declarative statements are available on the software providers' websites or whatever tools you are using, like Microsoft or ArcGIS or R packages. They do have that line which you can then put in your web resource, which basically gives you kind of refuge from any of the potential IPR breaches in the future. So this is a specimen of ReStore contributor permission form which you can use and which is available on the ReStore guidance page. That's what you can use to send out to all your contributors so that they are aware that once your resource is complete and once you have decided that it's going into the ReStore site, for example, then we would ask you to let all the contributors fill out this and send it to us, and then that will make part of the license which we will sign with your institution. So that's it's a couple of principles that maintain IPR. So IPR register, as I said earlier, it could be an Excel sheet. You can even handwrite it as well, but obviously you have to keep it in a separate secure space so that when required you can produce it. Permission for all content types. So the content types, it could be, as I said, audio, video, PowerPoint presentation, research paper, and record and contractual arrangements, and under which contract did you take the services from a individual or a group of individual based in a different institution than yours. And one of the examples are on the ReStore guidance pages. So if you go to ReStore guidance pages, we have shown a few case studies, shots, which can just give you a bit of more detail. But yeah, in any case or any problem or questions, please get in touch by sending it to our email info@restore.ac.uk. So that's something about ReStore deposition license. So its license is basically signed up between ReStore, which is based in the University of Southampton. So Southampton legal contract office represent us, and then in your case, or in your institution case, your contract office. So there are different sort of names that people use for contract offices, IPR office or contract office, which could be contacted at the time of restoring web resource. Undertakes to have undertaken due diligence checks for obtaining contributor permission. So that's sort of undertaking is kind of like binding upon the PI of the web resource that they are absolutely clear that they have obtained all the permissions, and then obviously we as a ReStore team are absolutely clear that all the contributor permissions form have been obtained before we make the web resource live on our website. Which the license, one of the license terms is that the resource definitely the resource has to be subject to editorial revisions, updates, metadata reformatting, etc. in the future if we have to update it. So there could be some designing issues or content typography issues for which we don't have to ask the PIs or the resource authors for that. That would be taken care of at the time of once the ReStore deposition license agreement is signed off, and that basically gives permission basically to show the licensor logos in our ReStore website and any other trademark. Which again, so under the logo, the link would always be going back to where exactly the resource was created, like University of Loughborough or Durham. So it's just like that we are kind of like promoting the use of organizations while hosting their content on the ReStore repository site. So the purposes of having a takedown policy is to mitigate risk from IPR infringement. So if at the time of due diligence check or at the time of deposition license agreement something declaration was made that all the permissions have been obtained, but there were some countries that for which we didn't have the contract, then in that case the takedown policy basically provides us a safety point to take the contents down if reported to us, and then to make the process clear and who to contact if somebody found that the article belonged to him or her, they made a contribution but they were not contacted before hosting the content on the ReStore repository site, then in that case that takedown policy shows who to be contacted with to take the content down, or what action will be taken. So in some cases, somebody would just be very direct in saying that they need to take the content down. Somebody would say I have to be in touch with them about the next action. Thinking it through ensures consideration of how such an issue would be handled. So if in the case of a complex issue, then it has to be consulted with our legal experts. And we had an instance whereby we were contacted basically to take down some materials because they were unaware of the contents being hosted on ReStore web repository website. So we did it, but then later on the issue was resolved, and the contents were put on the contents were put back on the ReStore website. So this is just a screenshot of the ReStore takedown policy, which you can access on restore.ac.uk/takedownpolicy.php. Policy and guidance. At present, no ESRC web resource policy. So that's so when we said at present no ESRC web resource policy, and that means that there is a data management policy, which some of you might already be aware of, but there isn't any clear-cut web resource policy. Increasing emphasis on institutional repositories, as Dave pointed out, that many the scholarly collections are archived in those institutional repositories, which are running on certain software platforms. ePrints might be well known to you, and then the key thing is to keep things open. Consider open educational repository. So that's another example to ensure that all the contents are openly accessible. No reason not to adapt best practice. No reason not to adapt best practice now, and support and guidance available. And so, for further details on ESRC research data policy, you can see that on the ESRC website, whereby which has been thoroughly detailed on their website.
My closing slide, the message to all there, but not detailed questions people want to talk about in the audio, is that our reflection on this is that getting further up that arrow to trying to deal with questions about what's going to happen with your online material right at the point where the project is conceived is the ideal. For most people, it's probably just about mentioned in the proposal. But the earlier you can get in terms of thinking about the actual project and what's being created, the better, because almost all of the issues we've had to deal with get harder as you are left towards the end of the project. And the moment the project team disperses, people actually go off, start focusing on different things, thinking about writing up maybe an end-of-the-world report. It becomes very difficult to get together the materials and the work that might be done in multiple work people. So our message to you is stitch in time.